Hello, traveler of the night. My name is Milo, and tonight I am here with you, gently by your side. Not to teach, not to fix, but simply to accompany you as a long day finally comes to a close. Have you ever wondered why a man who appears strong, rational, and steadfast on the surface, deep inside, carries something fragile, difficult to name, something that at times leaves him confused, emotionally distant, or even causes him to hurt himself and those he loves? Carl Gustav Jung believed that every man carries within him the eternal image of woman, not the image of this or that particular woman, but a definite feminine image. He called this image the Anima. When the Anima is forgotten, rejected, or suffocated by rigid masculine ideals, a man's inner world becomes dry, disconnected, and filled with inner conflict. But when the Anima is acknowledged and truly listened to, a profound transformation begins. This video is not an academic analysis. It is a slow journey into the depths of the mind, where Jung helps us understand why emotion, intuition, love, and tenderness do not make a person weak, but make them whole. If you have ever felt that something remained unnamed in your relationships, if you have ever wondered why you or the man beside you always seemed to be missing a piece, then tonight's journey is for you. If you are here with me in this moment, leave a small message. Simply tell me where you are listening from and what time it is where you are. Your presence alone has already made this night warmer. Now, allow yourself to let go. Feel the gentle weight of your body slowly melting into the bed. Relax, listen, and let the Anima speak as you gradually drift into sleep. You are enough, and you have always been enough. Part 1. The Threshold of the Night. Yes, the threshold of the night has always been the place where human beings are most honest with themselves. When the roles of the daytime fall away one by one, when the noise of the world quiets down until only the whisper of wind brushing against the window remains, the mind begins to step into a territory we often avoid in daylight. At the age of 45, a woman has passed through enough loss to understand that the inner life is not a straight road, but a labyrinth woven with invisible turns. There are dead ends that once drove us to despair. There are doors that remained tightly locked for decades. And there are silent figures waiting in the darkness, never having been named. Tonight, we do not begin with explanations, nor with rational analysis, because as Carl Jung once warned, when human beings attempt to approach the depths of the soul with sharp intellect alone, they usually touch only the surface. Jung wrote in The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, the intellect is only one among several fundamental psychic functions, and therefore does not suffice to give a complete picture of the psyche. For this reason, at the threshold of the night, we are invited to do something opposite to a lifetime of habit. Not to try to understand, not to try to control, not to rush to name what arises. We are invited to relax, to allow the mind to settle like a still lake under moonlight, where images may emerge on their own, according to their own rhythm. In this space, she appears. Jung called her the Anima, the unconscious feminine image that exists within the soul of every man. But the Anima is not an abstract concept meant only for books. She is a living psychological reality, directly influencing emotions, relationships, and the way a man loves, suffers, and withdraws. Jung wrote plainly, "Every man carries within him the eternal image of woman, not the image of this or that particular woman, but a definite feminine image. The problem is this: that image is often unrecognized. It is buried beneath layers of masculinity celebrated by society, reason, control, achievement, silence. And when the anima is forgotten, she does not disappear. She retreats into the darkness, waiting for the right moment to speak, most often through dreams, emotional eruptions, or relationships filled with contradiction. In midlife, a woman often senses this more clearly than anyone else. She does not observe only with her eyes, but with an intuition refined by years. She notices that the man beside her sometimes seems to live in a distant place, even while sharing the same room. She feels an invisible emptiness, not because of a lack of love, but because of a lack of connection to the feminine dimension within him. Jung called this the silent tragedy of the modern soul. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. The threshold of the night is a rare moment when the unconscious is given space to speak without interruption, not to accuse, not to fix, but simply to be seen. Jung believed that healing does not come from eliminating darkness, but from forming a conscious relationship with it. And the Anima is one of the most important gatekeepers in this process. In this opening space, we do not ask the listener to understand what the Anima is. We only invite them to listen to the softening sensation in the chest when there is no longer a need to be strong, to listen to a vague, nameless sadness, to listen to memories of old dreams where a feminine figure once appeared and faded like mist. Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Darkness, therefore, is not an enemy. It is a threshold, a place where one can step out of familiar roles and touch the deepest part of oneself. For the woman listening tonight, this threshold is also a safe space. Here she does not need to play the role of the understanding one, the enduring one, or the one who illuminates others. She only needs to be present as herself in stillness. And if you allow yourself to remain in the darkness long enough, the Anima will begin to speak, not in words, but in sensations, images, and the faintest inner vibrations. From there, a new journey may begin, not loudly, not by force, but just as Jung believed, true transformation always unfolds in silence. We will move gently into the next part very soon. Part 2. The Rigid Mask. As the wind outside the window gradually settles, as the breathing rhythm of the night becomes more even, we begin to realize that darkness does not merely open a door, it leads us deeper into the labyrinth of the human psyche. At that threshold, she, the Anima, has been named. But just as moonlight touches the inner lake, another image emerges, as well heavier, more solid, more unyielding. It is the mask a man carries throughout his life. Moving from part 1 into part 2, we do not leave the darkness behind. We simply step deeper into another chamber within it. If the Anima is what has been forgotten, then the persona is what has been held onto too tightly. And it is precisely at this point of intersection that pain begins to reveal itself. Have you ever felt that the man beside you stands behind an invisible stone wall? He is still there, still sharing meals with you, still talking about work, responsibility, plans. Yet something remains unreachable, not because there is a lack of feeling, but because emotion itself seems locked behind a hardened shell called proper masculinity. Carl Jung called this shell the persona, the social mask human beings wear in order to be accepted. But when the persona becomes too rigid, it no longer serves as a tool of adaptation. It turns into a prison. Jung wrote in 2 essays on analytical psychology. The persona is a kind of mask designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other, to conceal the true nature of the individual. The problem is not that a man has a persona. The problem is that he becomes completely identified with it. When logos, the principle of reason analysis and control, is worshipped as the highest value, everything softer is dismissed as weakness. Emotion is suppressed. Tears become a source of shame. Intuition is questioned, and slowly a barren desert forms at the very center of the inner life. The pain touched in Part 2 is not dramatic pain. It is silent loneliness. The loneliness of sharing the same room without truly meeting each other. A woman senses this clearly, not through argument, but through intuition. She feels that she is living beside someone who is always right, always strong, yet not fully present. Jung once warned that when a part of the psyche is denied, it returns in distorted form. He wrote, "What is not brought to consciousness comes to us as fate." A man who is overly identified with a masculine persona does not become more peaceful. On the contrary, he may grow irritable, closed off, or inexplicably distant, not because he does not love, but because he is no longer connected to himself. When emotion is labeled irrational, the soul begins to search for other exits through silence, through excessive work, or through uncontrollable outbursts. This part of the story is not meant to accuse men. Jung never did that. He understood that a rigid persona is often formed very early through messages such as "boys don't cry," "weakness is failure," "you must be strong to be worthy." Over time, the mask fuses to the skin until removing it feels like losing one's sense of direction. And yet, it is here that Jung opens a quiet window of hope. He does not call for the destruction of the persona, but for the recognition of its limits. He wrote, "The persona is not the true individuality, but a compromise between individual and society as to what a man should appear to be." When a man dares to admit that the mask is not the entirety of who he is, a small, crack appears in the stone wall, and through that crack, emotion begins to leak out at first, very softly, very awkwardly. It may appear as an unexplained fatigue, a nameless sadness at night, a strange dream that leaves him waking with a sense of emptiness. For the woman listening to this story, part 2 is also a permission to acknowledge her own loneliness without self-blame, permission to understand that the distance she feels is not entirely of her making, and permission to see the man before her not merely as a wall, but as a human being trapped within his own role. Touching the pain here is not meant to enlarge it, but to give it meaning. Jung believed that pain becomes destructive only when it is not understood. When illuminated by consciousness, it turns into a signal, a call toward a deeper transformation of the soul. And precisely at the fracture point of the persona, the next stage of the journey begins, where the anima starts knocking, more insistently demanding to be heard. Part 2 closes not with a solution, but with deliberate silence. A silence deep enough for you to recognize that behind the rigid mask, a current is still flowing. And if tonight we are patient enough to remain with the darkness, that current will carry us into the next part of the journey, where the soul finally begins to speak. Part 3. The image of the soul. After touching the rigid mask and sensing the silent fractures within the stone wall of the persona, another kind of silence emerges. It is no longer as heavy as pain, yet not quite peace either. It is the stillness of an unanswered question. If a man is not merely the mask that society sees, then what is living behind that shell? It is precisely within this open space that part 3 unfolds like a gentle breeze, no longer to confront, but to soothe, no longer to dissect, but to reconnect. Carl Jung never believed that a human being is formed by a single principle alone. Within the psyche of every man, he perceived another element, softer, deeper, and often forgotten. Jung called this element the anima, the image of the soul. Jung stated this clearly and without ambiguity. Every man carries within him the eternal image of woman, not the image of this or that particular woman, but a definite feminine image. This statement is not meant to deny masculinity. On the contrary, it expands the meaning of being human. Jung did not ask men to abandon strength. He asked whether they dared to admit that strength is not the entirety of who they are. The anima exists not to weaken a man, but to compensate for the inner dryness that a rigid masculine persona often leaves behind. Here, Jung leads us away from a logic of opposition. He does not place logos and eros on opposing sides. Logos, reason structure analysis, helps human beings shape the world. But eros, connection, emotion relationship, is what allows human beings to live within that world. Jung once wrote, "Where wisdom reigns, there is no conflict between thinking and feeling. The anima is the embodiment of eros within the male psyche. She is the capacity for subtle feeling, the intuition that listens to what has not yet been spoken, the quiet river of emotion flowing beneath a life that may appear dry and controlled. When the anima is rejected, that river does not disappear. It is merely pushed into the darkness, where it becomes murkier and more chaotic. Part 3 is no longer a place for the listener to identify pain, but a place where they are allowed to exhale. For the woman listening in the night, this is a crucial moment. She begins to recognize that the dryness of the man beside her is not his final essence. Behind the hardened shell, an image of the soul still exists, waiting to be named. Jung described the anima as a soul image, not a concrete person, but a psychological image that shapes how a man loves, desires, and searches for meaning. He wrote in The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, "The anima is not the soul in the dogmatic sense, not an hypostasis, but a natural archetype. This means that the anima is not something to be fixed, but something with which a relationship must be established. When a man begins to listen to the anima, he does not become vaguely soft or weakened. On the contrary, he becomes deeper, more capable of empathy, and most importantly, more connected to himself. Jung's philosophy here is soothing because it releases both sides from rigid roles. The man no longer has to strain himself into being an invulnerable symbol of reason. The woman no longer has to carry the role of an emotional substitute for someone who has severed his connection to his own soul. Each person is returned to their own inner responsibility. Jung emphasized that psychological imbalance does not arise from having too much emotion, but from lacking a conscious relationship with emotion. He wrote, "The Anima gives man courage and capacity for genuine love." This sentence reveals the promise of Part 3. When the Anima is acknowledged, love no longer becomes possession or dependency. It becomes the capacity for encounter between one person and another, and between a human being and their own soul. This is not a distant ideal, but a slow process, often beginning in the silence of the night. Part 3. Therefore does not push toward action. It does not demand that the listener do anything. It simply invites them to remain long enough with a new sensation, the sense that behind rigidity there is always a gentle current flowing, and that acknowledging this current does not cause the world to collapse, but makes it livable. When Jung's philosophy reaches this point, it no longer resembles a doctrine. It becomes a whisper saying that human beings do not need to be perfect, do not need to be purely masculine or purely feminine, do not need to be consistent according to social standards. They only need to become more whole, and within this soothing recognition, the journey continues. For when the image of the soul begins to take shape, the unconscious seeks to speak more fully, not through reason, but through dreams. Part 3 closes gently, preparing for the next step, where the Anima is no longer a concept, but becomes a living presence appearing within the dreams of the deep night. Part 4. Dream of the stranger. When the image of the soul has been named, when the Anima is no longer merely a philosophical concept, but becomes a vague sensation, breathing within the mind, another door opens naturally, not the door of reason, nor the door of daytime dialogue, but a door that opens only when consciousness begins to grow weary. It is the door of dreams. Part 3 offered soothing, but that soothing did not end the story. On the contrary, it softened the boundary between waking and sleeping, between thought and image. And precisely at that fragile threshold, the unconscious finds its own language. Jung emphasized that the unconscious does not speak in concepts, but in symbols. He wrote, "The dream is the small hidden door in the deepest and most intimate sanctum of the soul." As we enter Part 4, we no longer think about the Anima. We meet her. Imagine a man sinking into deep sleep, where the concerns of the day have fallen away. In his dream, he sees an unfamiliar woman dancing in the light of dusk. She has no name, no history, no connection to any familiar face. She is not a mother, nor a wife. It is precisely this strangeness that makes her captivating. According to Jung, this is not accidental. When the Anima appears in dreams in the form of a stranger, it indicates that she has not yet been integrated into consciousness. Jung wrote, "In dreams, the dream shows the inner truth and reality of the patient as it really is, not as I conjecture it to be, and not as he would like it to be, but as it is." The unfamiliar woman in the dream does not come to please the ego. She comes to guide. Her dance is not meant to seduce, but to invite. She invites the man and the woman, listening to this story as well, to step beyond the familiar territory of reason and enter the deep caverns of ancestral memory. Here, Part 4 no longer speaks of an isolated individual. It touches the collective unconscious, a core concept in Jung's thought. Jung believed that dreams contain not only material from personal life, but also traces of ancient images passed down through generations. He wrote, "In addition to our immediate consciousness, which is of a thoroughly personal nature, there exists a second psychic system of a collective, universal, and impersonal nature. The unfamiliar woman in the dream, therefore, does not belong only to the man who dreams her. She belongs to a deeper layer, where primordial feminine images existed long before names, roles, or social morality. She is humanity's memory of connection, of intuition, of the natural rhythm of living and dying. For the woman listening in the night, this image may stir a strange resonance. She realizes that the dream is not only his. It touches her as well touches the deep place where she has felt both closeness and distance from the man beside her. Part 4 allows her to understand that this distance is not merely a relational problem, but a sign of an unfinished inner journey. Jung believed that when the Anima appears in dreams as a stranger, it is the sign of an invitation to go deeper into the unconscious. But this is not a journey that requires a map. It requires surrender. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The deep caverns mentioned in Part 4 are not places to be feared. They become frightening only when we try to illuminate them with the flashlight of reason. In dreams, light is always dim, like twilight, like mist. And it is precisely within this unclear light that symbols can move freely, transform, and express what waking language cannot. The importance of Part 4 does not lie in interpreting the dream. Jung repeatedly warned against mechanical dream analysis. He emphasized the dream is its own interpretation. Therefore, the task of the listener is not to analyze, but to remain with the image. To remain with the sensation of seeing the unfamiliar woman turn away and disappear. To remain with the gentle sadness without a clear cause as the dream dissolves. To remain long enough for the unconscious to know that it is being heard. Part 4 marks the moment when the journey noticeably slows. There is no debate, no comparison, only the steady breathing of the night and images drifting like smoke. This moment is especially important for sleep, because only when consciousness stops grasping does the body and mind truly relax. And in this state of relaxation, the anima no longer needs to knock. She is already inside, not loudly, not demanding, simply present as a strangely familiar presence, reminding us that beneath every role, every mask, human beings still carry an ancient memory of wholeness. Part 4 closes not with a conclusion, but with a gradual drifting. The dream dissolves into deeper sleep. The image of the stranger fades into darkness. And there, the unconscious has completed its most important task it has been allowed to speak. From here, the journey will move into another phase, where what has not yet been integrated begins to demand stronger attention and is not always as gentle as it appears in dreams. We will step into the next part. Part 5. When the soul is possessed. When the dream of the stranger fades like smoke. When the image of dancing in twilight retreats into darkness, a subtle shift takes place. The silence of the unconscious is not always gentle. At times, precisely because it has been named, because it has been briefly glimpsed, the soul begins to demand. And when that call continues to be ignored, the anima no longer appears as a guide in dreams. She returns in anger. Part 5 opens here no longer as a dream, but as a consequence. Carl Jung called this state possession. When an archetype is not integrated into consciousness, it does not remain still. It takes over. Jung wrote, Possession occurs when the ego identifies with a complex. In this case, the man no longer has an anima. He is possessed by the anima. The paradox is this: the more the feminine within is denied, the more extreme, distorted, and destructive the anima becomes. She is no longer eros as connection, but turns into an emotional specter, volatile, bitter, and filled with resentment. A woman living beside such a man often senses this upheaval very clearly. There are days when he is so fragile that he clings, needing comfort like a child. On other days, he becomes cold, sarcastic, delivering words that wound more deeply than any open display of rage. Jung described this state with unsettling precision. The anima is responsible for moods, irrational emotions, and fantasies. But what matters here is not the cataloging of behavior, but the tragedy beneath it. Part 5 does not condemn the man. It illuminates an uncomfortable truth. When human beings refuse to mature psychologically, they do not become emotionally numb. They become infantile. Jung called this image puer aeternus, the eternal child. This is a man who is biologically adult, yet inwardly trapped in immature fantasies, wanting unconditional love, wanting to avoid responsibility, wanting to live forever in potential without ever confronting limitation. Jung warned, the man who cannot grow up remains a child in the unconscious. When a negative anima merges with the puer aeternus, a vicious cycle forms. The man feels empty and powerless, but instead of confronting this, he blames. He projects his anger outward onto the world, onto the woman closest to him. And the woman, unaware of the deeper source, begins to ask herself, what did I do wrong? Part 5 touches pain precisely at this point. This is the pain of being pulled into a script that is not one's own. The woman is drawn into the roles of mother-savior or disappointment roles, constructed by the man's unconscious to avoid facing himself. Jung called this unrecognized projection, and he wrote, everything that is unconscious in ourselves, we discover in our neighbor, and we treat him accordingly. What makes this state toxic is the absence of awareness. The man chum does not know that his anger is not truly directed at another. It is directed at the abandoned part of his own soul. But because that part has never been acknowledged, it can speak only through destruction. Part 5 does not promise immediate comfort. It forces the listener to pause before a stark truth. not all suffering is born of malice. Some suffering is born of arrested inner development. Jung once wrote a sentence that is cold yet deeply true. Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. The man possessed by the Anima refuses the necessary pain of growing up. Instead, he lives inside a distorted suffering, injuring himself and others. And it is here that Part 5 draws an invisible boundary for the woman. Listening. Empathy does not mean limitless endurance. But Jung does not leave us trapped in impasse. He believed that possession can occur only when consciousness is too weak to establish a relationship with the unconscious. When the light of awareness appears, the archetype loses its dominion. Jung wrote, "Freedom is the ability to say yes or no." Part 5 is therefore a pivotal moment in the journey. It is no longer a vague dream, nor yet a state of integration. It is a crisis point where every illusion is tested. If the man continues to flee, the Anima will continue to destroy. But if he stops, endures the collapse of his self-image, another path can open. For the woman, Part 5 is also a quiet awakening. She begins to understand that not every anger must be soothed, not every sorrow must be carried on her behalf. Some souls can be saved only when they themselves consent to enter their own darkness. Part 5 comes to a heavy but necessary pause. For only after possession is recognized can the journey move into another phase where the soul begins to learn the difference between emotion and responsibility, between love and dependency. And from the ashes of the pure Eternus, another feminine image, more mature, more grounded, will slowly begin to emerge in the next part. Part 6, Eve and Helen, Instinct and Beauty. After the storm of possession, when irrational anger, toxic words, and the immaturity of the eternal child have been named for what they are, a deep weariness sets in. This is no longer physical fatigue, but the exhaustion of the soul after illusion has collapsed. Part 5 forced us to look directly at the tragedy of arrested development, and only when light has reached that most painful point can the journey shift into a different rhythm, a rhythm of soothing through understanding. Part 6 opens not to argue right or wrong, but to bring order to what has been chaotic. Jung believed that the Anima is not a fixed entity. She develops. She grows along with the man. or she does not grow if he stops halfway. Jung described this process as a sequence of symbolic images reflecting the level of maturity of the soul. He wrote, "The anima has a character that is independent of the ego. This means that the anima does not automatically evolve with age or social status. She develops only when a man dares to enter into a conscious relationship with his own inner life. Within this process, Eve and Helen represent the first two stages, necessary, natural, but not the final destination. Eve is the anima at the instinctual level. Here, a man seeks in a woman nourishment, protection, and a primal sense of safety, as a child once sought the mother's embrace. This is not something to be ashamed of. Jung understood that every human being begins with the need to be held, to be protected, to be loved unconditionally. He emphasized that early images leave deep imprints in the unconscious, and he wrote, "The first image of woman is the mother." When the anima remains at the level of Eve, relationships become a place for fulfilling emotional survival needs. The man loves in order to be nourished. He needs the woman's presence to feel that he exists. For the woman, this role quickly becomes a burden, not because of a lack of love, but because she must carry the weight of an entire soul that has not yet separated from the cradle of childhood. But the journey does not end there. As the man begins to move away from primal dependence, the anima shifts into the image of Helen, the symbol of beauty, romance, and the longing to rise above ordinary life. Helen is no longer the mother. She is the muse, the ideal, the image that makes a man tremble and dream. Jung described this stage as a step forward, but also as a trap. At this stage, the anima is projected upon women who possess the characteristics of beauty and erotic charm. Helen brings a sense of vitality. She ignites passion, creative inspiration, and the belief that love can lift a person beyond the mundane. Yet precisely because she is placed upon a pedestal of idealization, Helen also becomes unreachable. The man loves not the real person, but the image created by his own anima. Here, Partsa begins to fulfill its soothing role. For as she looks back upon past infatuations, the woman listening in the night may breathe more lightly. She understands that not every promise was a lie, not every passion a deception. Sometimes these were simply the unsteady steps of a soul learning how to love without yet knowing how to truly encounter another human being. Jung did not condemn the Helen stage. He saw it as necessary because without ideals, human beings would never rise above instinct. But he also warned that if one remains here, love will always collapse when reality appears. Jung wrote, "The projection of the anima is a natural phenomenon, but it must be withdrawn if psychological development is to continue. This withdrawal of projection marks true maturation. When a man begins to see the woman before him, not merely as Eve or Helen, but as an independent individual with her own light shadow and limitations, the anima prepares to move into deeper stages. But part 6 does not rush ahead. It pauses long enough to perform one essential task to normalize the journey. By understanding Eve and Helen, the pain of part 5 is placed within a broader context. Possession, immaturity, idealization, all are no longer signs of malice, but signs of a process that has become stuck. And what is stuck, when seen with compassion, can begin to move again. Jung believed that healing does not come from denying the past, but from understanding its place within the whole story. He wrote, "Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries." Part 6 is therefore a necessary pause. It does not activate, it does not push. It allows the listener to lay down the burden of self-blame and blame of others. It whispers, "If we are here, then the journey is still unfolding." When Eve and Helen have been seen through, the soul can breathe more deeply. And within that breath, another image is waiting. No longer instinct, no longer idealized beauty, but something more mature, more equal. Yet to reach that place, the journey must continue through even more vivid symbols and deeper movements of the unconscious. Part 6 comes to rest gently, like a hand placed upon the chest after panic has passed. It does not conclude. It simply reorders the heartbeat. And when the rhythm has steadied, the night will carry us onward into the next part, where symbols no longer remain still, but begin to transform. That is the next stage. Part 7. The Dance of the Animals. When Eve and Helen have been seen through, when instinctual needs and romantic ideals have been placed in their proper positions within the journey of maturation, the mind begins to slow down. There is no longer a need to explain, no longer a need to categorize. Just enough understanding brings with it a new sense of safety, as if the soul can finally lie down after a long stretch of having to prove and protect itself. And it is precisely within this state of safety that the unconscious opens another door. Part 7 no longer belongs to the language of human beings. It belongs to a far more ancient language, the language of images, of instinct, of beings that have lived within the human psyche long before writing existed. Carl Jung called this the realm of living symbols, where the soul speaks through the forms of animals. Jung wrote, the unconscious uses dream symbolism as a means of expression. After reason has been soothed in Part 6, no further ideas are needed. The soul only needs to drift. And so, in this sleep, allow the image of a powerful lion to appear not as a predator, but as a guardian. The lion does not roar. It stands still grounded, protecting an inner kingdom that has just been restored to order. In Jungian symbolism, the lion often represents instinctual strength that has been tamed power that no longer needs to prove itself. For the listener in the night, this image carries a deep reassurance. It says, not every instinct is dangerous. Some instincts are meant to protect. Jung emphasized that instinct is not the enemy of consciousness. He wrote, instinct is nature's effort to achieve consciousness. When the lion has taken its post, a lighter movement appears. A butterfly passes through fragile, barely touching the air. The butterfly carries no force. It carries transformation. From a dark cocoon, through a complete dissolution, a new form emerges. Jung saw in this symbol a profound truth of the soul. No transformation occurs without the breakdown of the old form. Here, Part 7 performs a subtle task. It allows the listener to rest within transformation rather than fear it. The butterfly does not struggle to fly. It flies because the time has come. Jung once wrote, "We cannot change anything until we accept it." That acceptance is the breath of Part 7. No forcing of growth, no pushing toward awakening, only allowing what is ready to change its form. And then, from even deeper below an ancient symbol, rises the snake. In many cultures, the snake is both feared and sacred. It sheds its skin, is reborn, and moves between life and death. Jung devoted many pages to the snake as a symbol of primordial wisdom and untamed psychic energy. He wrote, "The snake symbolizes the instinctive wisdom of the unconscious. Within the context of this journey, the snake does not come to threaten. It comes to remind us that wisdom does not lie only in what we learn, but also in what we remember, the ancient memories of the body and the soul. When the snake appears, it is a sign that the unconscious has become safe enough to reveal deeper layers. Part 7 is therefore no longer a place to understand Jung. It is a place to be led by him. The listener does not need to analyze what the lion is, what the butterfly is, what the snake is. Jung repeatedly warned that premature analysis kills the symbol. He wrote, "The symbol is not to be dissected intellectually, but experienced. What matters is the sensation of being protected, the sensation of being allowed to dissolve, the sensation of being reborn without effort." For the woman listening in the night, Part 7 is a rare moment in which she no longer has to hold any role at all. Not the understanding one, not the supporter, not the one who endures. She is simply a living being, breathing alongside living symbols. Jung believed that when human beings allow the unconscious to speak in its own language, a natural regulation occurs. No willpower, no plan. He wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." But in Part 7, that pain has been softened. It is no longer a tearing apart, but a slow movement, like a dance. The lion, the butterfly, the snake do not appear at once. They alternate rhythmically, like a choreography of inner life reorganizing itself. Part 7 is therefore especially important for sleep. It marks the moment when the mind stops trying to move forward and begins to drift downward. The symbols do not pull the listener upward. They lull them deeper into a safe unconscious. And when the animals have completed their dance, no conclusion is needed. They dissolve into the darkness like creatures returning to the deep forest. The soul, having been protected, transformed, and reborn, can rest. But the journey is not yet complete. For after the unconscious has opened in this way, another question will slowly emerge, no longer about instinct, but about the responsibility of illumination. Part 7 closes in a moving silence, a living silence. And from that silence, the next step will begin to take shape, where what the unconscious has brought forth will begin to collide with real life, with relationships, and with the weight of projection. Part 8. The burden of projection. When the dance of the animals subsides, when the lion returns to its post as guardian, the butterfly dissolves into darkness, and the snake coils itself back into ancient silence. A fragile sense of safety emerges. The unconscious has been allowed to speak. Yet precisely when the symbols have fulfilled their roles, another question begins to surface. A question that no longer belongs to dreams, but to waking life. Where do the forces awakened in the unconscious go when daylight returns? Part 8 opens at this exact point of intersection. Have you ever felt exhausted from having to become a goddess in a man's eyes? Perfect, gentle, infinitely understanding. Or exhausted from being forced into the role of mother. Soothing, supporting, carrying emotions that he should have learned to face himself. This exhaustion does not come from loving too much. It comes from being seen in the wrong place. Carl Jung called this phenomenon projection. When an essential part of the psyche is not recognized within it, is thrown outward and attached to another person. Jung wrote plainly, projection is one of the commonest psychic phenomena. Projection is not a conscious act. A man does not intend to turn a woman into a goddess or a mother. He simply cannot connect with the anima within, and so the soul is forced to find another dwelling place. And the easiest place is the woman closest to him. When the anima is projected, the woman is no longer seen as a living individual with her own contradictions, limits, and needs. She becomes a screen upon which the man's unacknowledged longings and unnamed fears are displayed one by one. Jung described this distortion with chilling clarity. Everything that is unconscious in ourselves, we discover in our neighbor, and we treat him accordingly. Part 8 touches pain at this precise moment, the moment a woman realizes she is being loved for an image, not for who she truly is. On some days, she is placed upon a pedestal, idealized, revered. But this idealization carries a heavy price. She is not allowed to fail, not allowed to be weak, not allowed to be tired. And when she no longer fits the image, collapse comes swiftly and cruelly. Jung warned that projection not only distorts the one who receives it, but also arrests the growth of the one who projects. He wrote, "As long as the anima is projected, she remains outside. and the man is unconscious of her. This means that when the anima is placed upon a woman, the man postpones his own inner journey. He does not learn to listen to his emotions because someone else does it for him. He does not learn to face fear because a goddess shields him. And the woman, knowingly or not, is drawn into becoming a substitute for an unintegrated part of his soul. Part 8 does not condemn love. It draws a subtle boundary between love and appropriation. Love allows the other to be who they are. Projection does not. Projection demands that the other carry something that does not belong to them. Here the pain becomes profoundly human, for the woman is not only saddened by being misunderstood, she is saddened by being erased. Her right to be an ordinary human being with good days and weary days, with moments of strength and moments of weakness, is taken away. Jung observed that when projection collapses, both sides suffer. He wrote, "When an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. That collapse often comes when reality can no longer sustain the image. When the woman refuses to continue being a goddess or a mother. When she sets down a burden that was never hers. And at that very moment, the man feels betrayed, not because she has changed, but because the image within him has fallen apart." Part 8 therefore becomes a painful but necessary permission. Permission for the woman to recognize that her exhaustion is not selfishness. It is the signal of a violated boundary. Permission to understand that empathy does not mean self-erasure. Jung never encouraged the dissolution of individuality. He believed that healthy relationships can exist only between two individuals with clear boundaries. He wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. True transformation occurs only when projection is withdrawn. When the man begins to realize that the goddess and the mother do not exist outside, but within him as an unfinished task. And when the woman is returned the right to be herself, neither more nor less." Part 8 closes with a sober pain, not dramatic, not explosive, simply the slow realization that some burdens cannot continue to be carried for another, and that some souls grow only when they are forced to walk on their own. But Jung does not stop at rupture. He believed that when projection is withdrawn, a new possibility emerges, the possibility of meeting a real human being rather than an image. And from the space left behind by projection, another kind of connection, deeper and more equal, can begin to take root. Part 8 is therefore a turning point. It touches pain in order to open the way toward a higher transformation, where love is no longer the act of carrying another's burden, but the companionship of two free souls walking side by side. And when the burden is finally set down, the night can continue to guide us into the next part, where more mature images of the Anima begin to appear, no longer demanding, no longer possessing. Part 9. Mary and Sophia, Virtue and Wisdom. When the burden of projection has been set down, when the woman is no longer forced to carry the image of a goddess or a mother on behalf of an unformed soul, a quiet space emerges. At first, this space may feel disorienting because it is accustomed to being filled with roles and expectations. Yet it is precisely within this emptiness that another form of connection begins to take root, no longer based on possession, no longer on idealization, but grounded in respect and awareness. Part 9 opens here not as a radiant peak, but as a soft, stable field of light, where love no longer needs to prove anything. In the developmental progression of the Anima, described by Jung Mary, appears when a man begins to lift love beyond the levels of instinct and romance. At this stage, attraction is no longer driven by the urge to possess, but guided by virtue, not in the sense of rigid morality, but in the sense of reverence for what is sacred in another human being. Mary is neither the nurturing mother nor the distant muse. She is the image of inner purity, where love does not need to demand in order to exist. This is a crucial transition after Part 8, for when projection has been withdrawn, the man no longer needs a perfect image to cling to. He begins to see the woman as a human being with her own depth, not someone who must save him, but someone who walks beside him. Jung believed that this shift in perception allows the relationship to step out of the recurring cycle of idealization and disappointment. Yet Mary is not the final destination. She opens the path, but does not remain there. When love has been purified of possessive need, the Anima continues to evolve into Sophia wisdom. At this stage, the man does not merely respect the woman. He recognizes the profound equality between two conscious subjects. The woman is no longer a symbol of what he lacks, but a complete individual with her own independent and rich inner world. Sophia does not arrive through emotional intensity. She arrives through the quietness of understanding. She represents wisdom that has passed through darkness, has moved through instinct, romance, possession, and projection. This is the stage at which a man can be in relationship without losing himself and without demanding that the other carry that burden for him. Jung called this inner harmony syzygy, the marriage of opposites within the psyche, not masculinity, devouring femininity, nor femininity, dominating masculinity, but a living relationship between two principles. Jung described this meeting with a deeply human image. The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. At the level of Sophia, this transformation is no longer painful. It unfolds quietly, like a subtle realignment. The man does not need to become more feminine according to any external standard. He simply becomes more whole, capable of feeling, capable of reflection, capable of taking responsibility for his own inner life. And the woman within this space is returned the right to be herself, not idealized, not burdened, not reduced to a single role. Part 9 therefore carries a deeply soothing quality. It whispers that after all the fractures, misunderstandings, and unfinished stages, there still exists another possibility for love. A possibility that does not require drama in order to be meaningful. For the listener in the night, this is the moment when the body begins to fully release, because the soul has glimpsed a safe image of connection. Jung believed that psychological maturity does not lie in eliminating instinct or emotion, but in placing them into the right relationship with consciousness. When the anima reaches the image of Sophia, the unconscious no longer needs to shout for attention. It has been heard, integrated, and respected. Here, love is no longer a means of filling a lack. It becomes a space where two free human beings meet. No one must carry the other's soul. No one must serve as a symbol for what the other has not yet lived. And it is precisely within this equality that a deep sense of calm arises. The sense that there is a where else one needs to go in order to become complete. Part 9 does not end the journey with a declaration. It ends with a settling. like the surface of a lake after the wind has ceased, like a steady breath when the body has recognized that it is safe. This is the point at which the listener can release the final questions, because what matters most has been felt, not understood. Yet one step still remains. For after inner harmony has been touched, the soul must learn how to dissolve, no longer clinging to distinctions, no longer holding on to any image, even the most exalted one. And it is precisely from the maturity of Mary and Sophia that the final door will open, where all opposites return to a calm ocean of the unconscious. Part 10. The Birth of Venus. When the images of Mary and Sophia have fulfilled their roles, when love has been purified of possession, when wisdom has brought inner equality, a sense of wholeness arises. Not excitement, but a feeling of having arrived. At this point, the soul no longer longs to understand more, nor does it feel the need to repair anything. It only needs to drift. And it is precisely from this state of release that an ancient, gentle, luminous image steps forth from the collective unconscious, Venus. Part 10 is no longer a psychological process. It is contemplation. Allow yourself to enter Sandro Botticelli's The Birth of Venus. Upon the calm surface of the sea, Venus stands upon a seashell, her naked body entirely exposed, yet not erotic. She does not conceal herself because there is nothing left to conceal. All conflicts have settled. All opposites have been reconciled. Venus appears not as an object of desire, but as a living principle newly born. In Jungian language, this is no longer the Anima in a personal form. This is the Anima transformed into a universal symbol, no longer belonging to one man, one relationship, or one story. She is the rebirth of the feminine current, fully integrated into consciousness. Jung wrote of this moment in a tone almost poetic. The goal of psychological development is the self. Venus does not represent desire. She represents beauty, liberated from the instinct to possess. A beauty that does not need to prove itself, does not need to be desired, does not need to be held. She simply is like life itself, emerging from the deep sea. Here, Part 10 makes a very subtle movement. It carries the listener beyond even the concept of the Anima. For when the Anima has been integrated, she no longer needs to appear as a psychological figure. She dissolves into the entire inner life, just as Venus dissolves into air, light, and wind within the painting. Jung believed that symbols such as Venus do not belong to the individual, but to the collective unconscious. They emerge when humanity or an individual has become ready for a new cycle. He wrote, "Archetypes are, so to speak, organs of the pre-rational psyche. Venus, therefore, does not come to teach. She comes to soothe. For the man she cools the dry deserts of logos that have ruled for too long lands, where everything has been measured, analyzed, and controlled. For the woman listening in the night, Venus is a reminder that gentleness is not weakness, but a form of ancient wisdom. In part 10, the mind no longer needs to keep up. It is allowed to slow beneath the rhythm of the breath, allowed to see without commentary, allowed to feel without naming. Jung emphasized that there are stages of the inner journey that cannot be traveled by willpower. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And now, after the darkness has been passed through, the light is no longer blinding. It is soft. It is enveloping, like early morning light reflected upon the sea from which Venus has just been born." Part 10 is therefore the point of dissolution for the entire journey. No confrontation, no analysis, no conflict. Only life sensing itself in its most beautiful form. This moment is especially suited for deep sleep because the mind no longer has anything to do. It can rest. Jung believed that when a human being touches the self, the regulating center of the entire psyche, a sense of stability arises that does not depend on outer circumstances. He wrote, "The self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference, which embraces both conscious and unconscious." Venus is the image of that circle. She does not stand at the center of power. She stands between sea and sky, between unconscious and consciousness, as a perfect point of convergence. No sharp boundaries, no division between masculine and feminine. Only life being born from itself. Part 10 closes, not with a conclusion, but with a sense of drifting, as if the listener were floating upon water, supported without effort. Old questions no longer matter. Old roles are no longer required. Venus has been born, and with her, a different way of being has opened. Yet the journey is not entirely complete. For after beauty has been born, after the soul has been reborn, one final step remains to release even the image itself, to dissolve into the ocean of the unconscious where no symbol needs to appear anymore. And it is precisely from the complete gentleness of Venus that this final path begins to open slow, deep, and peaceful. Part 11. The Masterpiece of Individuation. As the image of Venus slowly dissolves into light and sea, as beauty no longer needs to be contemplated, but simply exists, a special kind of silence emerges. This is not emptiness, but the feeling of having gone far enough. There is no longer a desire to seek, no longer an impulse to understand anything more. At this point, the soul stands before a final threshold where all symbols gradually withdraw to make room for what is most essential. Part 11 opens precisely at this threshold. Carl Jung once said that the psychological journey does not end with understanding archetypes, but with becoming a whole human being. He wrote plainly and humbly, "Individuation is not the perfection of the ego, but the realization of the self." Here, Jung is not speaking of achievement, nor of inner victory. He is speaking of individuation, the process through which a person gradually becomes themselves, not by eliminating darkness, but by allowing every part of the psyche to have a legitimate place. Jung acknowledged that confronting the shadow is the first step, and also the step at which many people stop, for the shadow carries what is ugly, shameful, and difficult to accept. But Jung emphasized that this is only the gate. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Yet if one stops at the shadow alone, conflict remains. Only when the anima is encountered does the journey truly touch its creative depth. Jung regarded the encounter with the anima not as a moral trial, but as a psychological masterpiece, because it demands a rare kind of courage. The courage to enter the most vulnerable territory of oneself. When a man confronts the hidden woman within, he does not lose his masculinity. On the contrary, he escapes the poverty of a one-dimensional identity. The anima, once integrated, is no longer the source of possession, projection, or emotional chaos. She becomes a bridge between consciousness and the unconscious, between reason and feeling, between the individual and the deep life of humanity. Jung wrote of this moment with particular reverence. The anima is the archetype of life itself. This means that when the anima is accepted, a person does not merely understand themselves more, they live more deeply. Empathy is no longer a skill to be learned, but a natural reflex. Compassion is no longer self-sacrifice, but the result of having seen enough darkness within oneself to no longer fear the darkness in others. Part 11, therefore, carries a very different quality from the previous parts. It no longer speaks of a specific relationship between man and woman. It speaks of a new mode of presence. Here, love is no longer possession, no longer carrying another's burden, no longer idealization. Love becomes sharing between two people who are capable of carrying their own souls. Jung once wrote a sentence short in length, yet containing this entire philosophy. Where love rules, there is no will to power. When individuation takes place, power is no longer the center of relationship. No one needs to control. No one needs to be saved. Two people meet not to fill a lack, but to bear witness to one another's aliveness. This is what Jung called psychological maturity, where the individual neither dissolves into the collective nor collapses inward into the ego. For the woman listening in the night, Part 11 offers a profound soothing. It whispers that a love can exist that does not require you to become a symbol. A love in which you are allowed to be a complete human being with light and shadow, with days of strength and days of fatigue. And your presence is no longer a tool for another's growth, but an equal meeting. But Jung did not romanticize individuation. He knew it is not a permanent state, but a living process. He wrote, "Individuation is a process of differentiation, having for its goal the development of the individual personality." This means no one is ever finished. But once a person has tasted wholeness, they can never fully return to their old roles. Something has changed in how they love, how they listen, and how they are alone. Part 11 is therefore not a radiant climax. It resembles a slow closing movement of music, where every theme has been played long enough that it no longer needs repetition. Here the mind begins to release even the story of the anima of the shadow of developmental stages. These concepts have completed their task, and when philosophy has been lived, it no longer needs to be named. Part 11 closes with a deep settling. No longer the question, "Who am I?" no longer the question, "What must I do?" Only the feeling of being fully within oneself, undivided, intact. This is a moment especially suited for deep sleep, because the soul no longer has anything to guard. Yet one final step remains, for even wholeness, if clung to, can become a new image of the ego. And Jung knew that beyond every process, the most profound act is still letting go. To dissolve into the ocean of the unconscious, where there is no individuation, no journey, no masterpiece left to complete. From the ripeness of individuation, the final door is opening quietly, without invitation, without urgency. And from there, the journey will move toward its most natural ending, returning and dissolving. Part 12. Dissolving into the ocean of the unconscious. When the masterpiece of individuation has completed its role, when a human being has tasted that rare moment of inner wholeness, something very strange occurs. There is no longer a need to hold on to anything. Even wholeness itself, if clung to, can become a subtle form of the ego. Jung understood this clearly. He knew that the deepest psychological journey does not end in understanding, but in letting go. And it is precisely here that Part 12 opens not as a new chapter, but as the dissolution of all chapters. Now the voice of the story begins to soften, not because there is nothing left to say, but because nothing more needs to be said. The symbols have fulfilled their mission. The shadow has been seen. The anima has been encountered, integrated, and transformed. The self has been touched. And once the center has been felt, the mind no longer needs to keep circling around it. Jung once wrote a very quiet sentence, yet one that carries the weight of a lifetime of contemplation. The highest and most decisive experience is to be alone with oneself. But the aloneness Jung speaks of is not isolation. It is the state in which a person is no longer divided from themselves, and therefore no longer divided from the world. In this state, the boundary between the individual and the collective begins to soften, and within that softening, the final image of the journey appears the ocean of the collective unconscious. Imagine yourself as a drop of water, without a name, without a history, without a role. That drop has once been rain, a river vapor ice. It has had form collided, changed. But now it no longer needs to keep its shape. It falls into the ocean, not as a loss, but as a return. Jung called this ocean the collective unconscious, the deepest layer of the psyche, where archetypal images no longer belong to me or you, but to life itself. He wrote, "The collective unconscious is a part of the psyche which can be distinguished from a personal unconscious by the fact that it does not owe its existence to personal experience. Here there is no longer a division between masculine and feminine, no longer anima or animus as opposing concepts. Those principles have completed their work of connection and now dissolve into a deeper rhythm, the rhythm of breath, of pure being." Part 12 no longer carries healing in the conventional sense. It carries existential lullaby. It allows the listener, especially the woman of the late night, to lay down every final question. No more, am I good enough? No more have I understood. No more, what must I do next? Jung reminded us that there are phases of inner life in which consciousness must learn to withdraw. He wrote, "Consciousness is like a surface on which things float. The unconscious is the great depth beneath. To dissolve into the ocean of the unconscious does not mean losing oneself. On the contrary, it is the moment when the self no longer needs to defend itself. When all conflicts have been reconciled, peace is no longer a state to be achieved. It becomes a natural condition. Here the anima has found her home, no longer projected, no longer possessed, no longer forced to appear as dreams' images or crises. She has dissolved into the whole of psychic life, like salt dissolving into water. And so has the woman who listens. She no longer has to be a symbol for anyone, no longer has to carry another's soul. She is permitted to rest within herself. Jung believed that the deepest peace does not come from controlling life, but from consenting to its flow. He wrote, "Life has always seemed to me like a plant that lives on its rhizome. That hidden root is the unconscious, where everything is born, dies, and is reborn without the intervention of the ego." Part 12 allows the listener to return there, not to disappear, but to be held. Now only the steady breath remains. No need to adjust it. No need to try. Each breath is a small wave arriving, departing. And between these waves, there is nothing to hold on to. Nothing left to understand. Part 12 does not end the journey with a wish for success or awakening. It ends with a very simple permission: you are allowed to sleep. Jung never regarded sleep as escape. He saw it as a necessary return of consciousness to a deeper source. He wrote, "In sleep, we pass into the unconscious, into the wellspring of psychic life." And so, this ending does not call you to wake up. It calls you to dissolve. Dissolve into the night. Dissolve into the breath. Dissolve into the ocean to which all souls have always belonged. There is no more story to be told, no more journey to complete. Everything is enough. Everything is at rest. Sleep well, woman of the late night.